Hello and welcome back to the Consistory of the Coelc YouTube channel. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Zabel of St John's Evangelical Lutheran Church located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. And we're going to be continuing my What It Means to Be a Lutheran lecture series with Article 11 of Part 3 of Luther's Smalcald articles on the topic of priestly celibacy. So, in Article 10, Luther dealt with the ministry, and in Article 12, he's going to deal with the church. And normally when you're writing articles, like kind of Melanchthon does in the Augsburg Confession, you go church, then ministry. Luther breaks this up by discussing priestly celibacy. As Willard Albeck wrote in his Studies in the Lutheran Church, since Luther was thinking about clergy, he takes a quick detour to discuss priestly marriage. Now, Luther begins by stating that Rome doesn't have the right to forbid priestly marriage. We know this from Scripture. In 1 Timothy 3:2, Paul says that the bishop is to be the husband of one wife. Now, this is not a command that all clergy must be married, but it shows that they can be married as long as they do not engage in polygamy. And we know from Scripture that many clergy were married, such as St. Peter. He has a mother-in-law, and while his wife is never explicitly mentioned in Scripture, she does appear in the extra-biblical church traditions about Peter's life outside of Scripture. And we also know from 1 Corinthians 9:5, St. Paul says that Peter, the other apostles, and also the brothers of Jesus all had wives. And so, how can the Pope, the supposed successor to Peter, forbid priests from having wives when Peter, the supposed first pope, had a wife himself? So, Scripture is clear that priests can get married. However, in this article, Luther does not focus on what Scripture says. Instead, he gives more practical reasons. The first reason is going to be the practical side regarding sin, and the second one's going to be natural law, which we'll get to in a second. Regarding Luther's first reason, sin, he says that this prohibition by the Roman Catholics on priests is an unnecessary great burden on this divine estate of the ministry, and it has given rise to all kinds of horrible, abominable, countless sins of unchastity. You see, throughout Scripture, there are 4 different reasons given for the estate of marriage. The first is the first one that pops up, that man needs a helper. As God says back in the Garden of Eden in Genesis, it is not good for man to be alone, and so in order for man to be successful, he needs a partner, a wife. The second reason is one of the most obvious. It's the reproduction, that after man and woman were created, God said, go forth and multiply. Men and women get married so they can have a family and have kids. The third, and this one pops up in Ephesians, is the divine symbolism. That there is the marriage between the man and the woman is a symbolic representation of the relationship between God or Christ and the church. And the fourth reason, and this is one that takes place only after the fall, but it is given in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, is sexual chastity. See, God has implanted in man and woman at the beginning the desire to have sex with each other, to reproduce. They are commanded to go forth and multiply. God has created them with the desire to multiply. Now, before the fall, man and woman were perfect, and they would have had a perfect control over these desires. But since the fall, many men and women cannot control themselves. In Article 23 of the Augsburg Confession, Philip Melanchthon, when he's discussing priestly celibacy, notes that while it is true that singleness is a practically virtuous vocation, since one can devote himself fully to the service of God, not all are capable of this, and that therefore the holy estate of marriage has been instituted as an appropriate place for men and women to engage in physical relationships so they do not fall into sexual morality. Likewise, we read in Matthew 19:11, Jesus says that not all can accept the life of singlehood. And in 1 Corinthians 7:9, St. Paul says that, yes, while he would prefer everyone remain single, if one cannot control his sexual desires, then he should marry lest he burn with passion. Luther also discusses this in the Large Catechism on the Sixth Commandment, where he says that there are some, albeit a very rare few, who do have this supernatural gift best given to them by God, where they can control themselves outside of marriage. However, Luther says where nature functions as God created it, it is not possible to remain chaste outside of marriage, and therefore God has instituted marriage as an appropriate place for men and women to engage in sex. Just as God has established the vocations of soldier and executioner as an appropriate place where murder or killing can take place, so too God has established marriage as an appropriate place for sex to take place. And so when Rome forbids this, it leads to many, many abominable sins, and this is something that plagued the Church of the Middle Ages. Luther mentions on his trip to Rome that there was a brothel on every corner, and one specially dedicated just for priests. There are stories of monks and nuns engaging in adultery or sex outside of marriage within the monasteries and nunneries, sometimes with the opposite sex, but also a lot of the times with the same sex. So you got homosexuality going on there. There were many priests and popes who had mistresses and illegitimate children born out of wedlock. And there are even rumors of pedophilia and bestiality. Luther, in his day, he's discussing some of the sexual sins that plague the clergy, and he doesn't even name them because they are so abominable. And it is believed by Luther scholars that these are references to things like homosexuality and even pedophilia or bestiality. And if anyone thinks this is just a problem of the Middle Ages, think about the modern day Roman Catholic Church and the issues that, well, the scandals that went on there. So Luther says all of this is a result of this unnatural burden placed upon the clergy. And the reason this happens is that these sins go contrary to God's natural law, which is Luther's second reason given in this article. He says that, in the beginning, God created men and women, and God created men to marry and sleep with women, and vice versa. And therefore, says Luther, we have no more power to forbid marriage than we do have the power to change a man into a woman or a woman into a man. And what is interesting is that this simple line from Luther is very relevant to today when we have to deal with the issues of transgenderism and transsexuality. These issues didn't exist in Luther's day, but Luther has already put forth in this one statement the Lutheran position on transgenderism. Luther teaches that we don't have the power or ability to change a man into a woman or a woman into a man, or to abolish the distinctions between the sexes. In this, Luther condemns transgenderism, homosexuality, and also the feminist lie that men and women are the same. It is clear in Genesis that God created them male and female, and he created men to be the head and women to be the helpers. Men and women are different, and they are created for one another. We cannot simply turn a man into a woman or a woman into a man. We cannot simply swap out a man for a woman. Men are men, and men will marry women. Women are women, and women will marry men. This is the order as God created it. This is the natural law. And this order is not to be changed or altered. Men cannot try to be women, and women cannot try to be men. And not just like physically, like with sex changes and transgenderism, but also even socially. Men are to be the leaders and the heads of the household, and women are to be submissive and to serve as helpers. Men are not to seek out womanly roles, and women are not to seek out manly roles. And so Luther says that just as we don't have this power to change or abolish sex and gender, we don't have the power to forbid marriage either, because that too would be going contrary to the natural order as God created it. And to do so is the teachings of demons and the marks of the Antichrist. As we read in 1 Timothy 4:1, St. Paul says, in the latter times, some will renounce the faith by paying attention to deceitful spirits and teachings of demons. And in verse 3, one of these demonic teachings Paul lists is the forbidding of marriage. This papist prohibition on the marriage of priests is a violation of Scripture, a violation of God's natural law, and it is a great burden on the priests that has led to all kinds of horrible, abominable, countless sins. Therefore, says Luther, we cannot consent to this miserable priestly celibacy, and we will not tolerate it. That's our video on this article. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.